I went to the cabin because I needed quiet. That is the honest reason. I had been tired for months in a way sleep did not fix. My head felt full all the time, like noise stuck inside it. The cabin was listed as old, basic, and far from town. It sat near a logging road that barely showed up on maps. I told myself that meant peace. I told myself I would read, cook simple food, and breathe air that did not smell like cars or smoke. The drive took most of the day. The road turned from smooth to cracked, then to gravel, then to dirt with deep lines cut into it. Trees pressed in closer the farther I went. The sky was low and gray, and the light felt flat, like the world had been rubbed thin. When I finally reached the place, the cabin looked smaller than the photos. It leaned a little to one side. The wood was dark from years of rain. The roof had patches where the metal was dull and bent. There were no other buildings in sight. Just trees, thick and close, and the sound of wind moving through them like a low breath. Inside, the air smelled old and cold. Dust hung in the light from the small windows. The floor creaked under my boots. There was a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a sink with a hand pump, and a small stove. No power. No signal. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they made sense. I felt calm at first. The kind of calm that comes when nothing is asking anything from you. That night, rain started. It was not gentle rain. It came down hard and steady, hitting the roof with a sharp sound that filled the cabin. I lay in bed and listened. The walls seemed thinner at night. I could hear the trees moving, branches rubbing, leaves shaking. Every sound felt close. I told myself this was normal. Old cabins make noise. Forests are loud when you stop drowning them out with other things. The second day I walked the area. The ground was soft and dark. The trees were tall and straight, their trunks damp to the touch. I noticed old cut marks on some of them, half-healed, rough and uneven. The logging road curved behind the cabin and disappeared into the trees. There were footprints in the mud, not fresh but not very old either. They were heavy, deep at the heel. I told myself they were from workers or hunters. This land was not untouched. It just felt that way. That afternoon, I found a small shed behind the cabin, half hidden by brush. The door hung open on one hinge. Inside were rusted tools, a broken chair, and empty cans. The floor was packed dirt. The smell in there was sharp and stale. I did not like it. I did not know why. I closed the door as best I could and went back inside the cabin. That night, the rain stopped, but the air felt thicker. I woke up more than once, not sure what had pulled me out of sleep. Each time I listened hard. I heard nothing clear. Just the normal sounds of night, stretched out and uneven. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to breathe slowly until my chest stopped feeling tight. On the third day, I noticed the first thing that did not make sense. The latch on the door was lifted when I woke up. I knew I had pushed it down the night before. I am careful about things like that. I stood there staring at it, my hand resting on the wood. The cabin had one door. No windows opened wide enough for a person. I checked the floor. There were no clear marks. The ground outside was dry now, the mud firming up. I told myself the latch could have shifted. Old metal moves. Wood warps. Still, I started keeping my bag closer. I lined up my boots near the bed so I could step into them fast if I needed to. I kept the small knife I used for food on the table instead of putting it away. These were quiet changes. I did not want to admit fear to myself. That afternoon, I heard something behind the cabin. A slow sound like weight shifting. Not an animal running. Not leaves falling. I was careful. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited a long time before moving again. When I finally stepped outside, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadow. The quiet after felt heavy, like pressure on my ears. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay awake, counting the seconds between sounds. At some point, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow. Measured. Wood creaking under weight. I did not move. I did not breathe. I stared at the dark ceiling and felt my heart beat hard against my ribs. The steps paused near the door. I waited for the latch to lift. It did not. After a long time, the steps moved away. I stayed frozen until the light began to change at the window. In the morning, I saw marks on the porch. Scrapes in the dirt. A dent where someone had leaned or stood for a while. I felt sick then, the kind of sick that starts low and rises. I packed some of my things, then stopped. I told myself to think clearly. Panic makes mistakes. I decided to leave after one more day. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself this place was messing with my head. The fourth day was the worst. I found food missing. Not a lot. Just enough to notice. A can gone. Bread torn open. I checked every corner of the cabin. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked forced. That meant something else. That meant someone knew how to move quietly. That meant someone had been inside while I was asleep or away. I did not cook that night. I did not want the smell to carry. I ate cold food and sat with my back to the wall. The forest felt closer than ever. The dark outside the windows looked thick, like it had weight. When the footsteps came again, they circled the cabin. Slow, patient. I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way. In a steady, calm way that felt worse. Whoever it was did not rush. They did not make noise by accident. At some point the door handle moved. Just a little. Enough to tell me it was not the wind. I stood there shaking, my hands numb. The latch held. The handle went still. Time stretched. I do not know how long it lasted. When the sounds finally faded, I did not relax. I stayed awake until my body felt hollow. At dawn I packed everything. I did not clean. I did not look back. I stepped outside and stopped cold. My car would not start. The key turned. The engine clicked. Nothing else. I tried again and again until my hands hurt. The quiet pressed in. I felt very small then, standing there with my breath showing in the air. I took only what I could carry and started down the logging road on foot. The trees seemed taller now. The road felt longer. I walked fast, then faster. I did not run. I did not want to trip. Every sound behind me felt sharp. Every break in the trees felt like a place someone could be standing. After hours my legs burned. My throat was dry. When I finally saw another vehicle parked near a wider road, my knees almost gave out. I kept walking until I reached it. I did not stop until I reached town. I did not tell anyone everything. I said the cabin was not safe. I said someone else had been using it. Weeks later, I learned the place had been used by a man who lived off the land, moving between empty buildings, staying just out of sight. He had been doing it for years. People had reported missing food, open latches, marks that did not make sense. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that made headlines. Just enough to make people leave. The ending is clear to me now. There was no mystery. There was no monster. There was a person who knew the woods better than I ever could. I wanted silence, and I found someone who had learned to live inside it. I left with my life because I listened to the fear when it finally spoke loud enough. I never went back for the rest of my things. I did not need them. I needed distance. I needed light. I needed places where footsteps have names and doors have locks that mean something. I had always loved the idea of being alone in the woods. The thought of escaping the constant noise of the city, the buzzing of notifications, the hum of people always moving somewhere, made me feel like I could finally breathe. So when I found a small, secluded cabin listed online, tucked deep in the forest miles from the nearest town, I didn't hesitate. The description promised total isolation, a quiet spot by a small creek and enough space to write, think, and disappear for a few days. I didn't expect it to feel threatening, but by the time the sun began to dip below the thick line of trees, I started to realize isolation can sometimes be suffocating. The drive to the cabin was long and bumpy. The road disappeared halfway through into a narrow dirt path, and the forest grew thicker with every turn. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, though I knew it was absurd. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I imagined, built from weathered logs with a rusted tin roof and a small chimney that didn't look like it had been used in years. The windows were dusty, but from inside I could see the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. A small trail led down to a creek that glistened in the evening light. I parked my car next to a stack of old firewood, grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old pine. Dust covered every surface, and a thin layer of grime made the windows almost opaque. I opened the shutters and let the last light of day pour in, brushing away cobwebs that hung in the corners. There was a small kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, a tiny living area with a sagging couch, and a loft above with a bed that looked like it had seen better decades. I unpacked my bag, set up my laptop on the table, and stared out the window, feeling the forest pressing in on me from all sides. It was beautiful, almost unbearably so. That first night I slept fitfully. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional crack of a branch snapping outside. I kept waking up thinking I heard footsteps, but each time I told myself it was just the wind or an animal. By morning, my nerves were frayed and I realized I hadn't thought about how truly alone I was. No phone signal, no neighbors, no passing cars, just me and the forest. I decided to explore before settling in. The trail by the creek wound through the trees and ended at a small clearing. I followed it slowly, stepping over roots and rocks, listening to birds chirp nervously in the underbrush. There was something both calming and suffocating about being so deep in nature, surrounded by towering pines that blocked most of the sky. The forest floor was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the soft earth with every step. I noticed animal tracks, deer, maybe a fox, but nothing that made me uneasy. I breathed in the smell of wet leaves and pine needles and told myself this was exactly what I needed. Peace, quiet, and time to think. That night, the wind picked up. I was sitting in the cabin reading when I heard the first real sound that made me freeze. A scraping noise, faint at first, came from outside the cabin. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone dragging something across the dirt. I told myself it was probably a branch or a rock falling, but my chest tightened. I checked the windows, nothing but trees and darkness. I kept listening. The sound moved closer to the cabin, circling, and then it stopped. My heart was pounding. I wanted to convince myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the rest of the night in the loft, the small flashlight on the table my only comfort. Every creak of the cabin floor made me jump. I kept thinking about how far away I was from help, how easy it would be for someone to come up to the cabin without me knowing. I tried to calm myself, imagining the forest as my protector, but it didn't work. I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. My stomach sank when I noticed faint footprints in the mud leading toward the back of the cabin. They were fresh, too precise to be random animal prints, human-sized. I followed them carefully, hoping they led to someone else staying in the woods, but they ended abruptly at the edge of the tree line. No one was there. My hands shook and I realized I hadn't thought to bring anything for protection. I made a mental note to be more careful. I spent the next day keeping busy. I chopped some wood, cleaned the cabin, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The sun was bright and the forest seemed friendly again. I started to write in my notebook, trying to lose myself in words, but by nightfall the unease returned. That evening I heard the scraping noise again. This time it was accompanied by faint rustling sounds, like someone moving quietly through the underbrush. I stayed frozen at the window, watching shadows shift between trees. The sound stopped, leaving the forest silent again. By the third night I was on edge. I barely slept, jumping at every creak. Around midnight I heard footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped and my first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide that felt safe. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a cast iron pan from the kitchen, and sat at the table listening. The footsteps moved around the cabin, circling it completely. I didn't dare look out the window. Then they stopped. I waited, heart hammering, until the first light of dawn started seeping through the trees. When I finally forced myself outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. A circle of disturbed earth around the cabin, branches broken, leaves scattered, and faint marks in the dirt that looked like someone had been pacing, studying the cabin. I realized the person had been outside all night, watching me, waiting. My legs nearly gave out. But I knew I couldn't panic. I had to survive until I could get help. I grabbed my car keys and ran back to the car, checking over my shoulder constantly. I drove back down the dirt path faster than I had arrived, every shadow between the trees making me flinch. By the time I reached the main road, I could finally call for help. The police took my statement and checked the area, but the person was gone. They told me that remote cabins were sometimes targeted by trespassers, people who liked the thrill of stalking someone isolated. They advised me to avoid going back alone. I never returned to that cabin. But in the months afterward, the memory stayed with me. Every time I'm in a quiet place, I remember the scraping, the footsteps, the complete feeling of being watched. I've learned to respect isolation differently now, not as a peaceful escape, but as a reminder of how vulnerable we can be when there's no one else around. I also made sure to always tell someone where I'm going, even for small trips. That experience was terrifying, but it taught me how to stay aware, how to protect myself, and how real fear doesn't need ghosts or myths. It can come from a living, breathing human who you never see until it's almost too late. The forest is still beautiful in my memory, but it's no longer just a place of peace. It's a place I respect and a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not supernatural, they're very real and very close, even when you can't see them. I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet, not because I was brave. The place sat deep in the trees, far from the main road, with one narrow dirt path that twisted like it didn't want visitors. I arrived late afternoon, the light already thin and yellow, and the woods felt heavy, like they were holding their breath. The cabin was smaller than the photos online showed. One room, a tiny bathroom, and a porch that leaned a little to the left. The wood smelled old and wet, like it had soaked up years of rain and never fully dried. I told myself that smell was normal. Old places always smelled like that. Inside, everything was basic. A couch with fabric worn smooth in the middle. A small table with one chair that didn't sit level. A bed pushed against the wall with a thin blanket folded at the end. Dust rested on every surface, even though the place was supposed to be cleaned. I ran my fingers across the table and saw a clean line where my skin had been. It bothered me more than it should have. I opened the windows to let air in, but the forest air felt cold and damp, not fresh. I closed them again. I unpacked slowly, like moving slow would make the place feel safer. Outside, the trees creaked when the wind moved through them. Not loud, just enough to remind me they were there. I kept noticing little things that felt off. The lock on the door was newer than the rest of the cabin. The hinges were shiny, like someone had replaced them recently. The porch light worked, but the bulb inside flickered and went out after a few seconds. I changed it with a spare I found under the sink. It stayed on this time, but it hummed softly. As it got darker, the forest changed. During the day it felt open, but at night it pressed in close. The windows turned into black mirrors, showing my own reflection more than anything outside. I cooked a simple meal and ate standing up because sitting felt too relaxed. I kept listening for sounds that didn't belong. Most of what I heard could be explained. Branches rubbing together. An animal moving through leaves. So my shoulders stayed tight. I went to bed early, telling myself that sleep would reset my nerves. The bed creaked when I turned. The mattress dipped in the middle, like many people had slept there before. I stared at the ceiling, counting the lines in the wood, trying to keep my thoughts steady. That was when I heard the first real sound that didn't fit. It came from outside, near the back of the cabin. Not loud, not sharp. Just a slow dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across dirt. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I waited, telling myself it was probably an animal. Deer came close to cabins sometimes. I lay there for a long time, my eyes burning from staying open. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up to the same sound, closer this time. It came from the side of the cabin, near the wall where the bed was. The dragging noise moved, paused, then moved again. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed still, afraid that even breathing would give me away. I thought about the thin wall between me and whatever was outside. I thought about how far the nearest neighbor was. I didn't know exactly, but I knew it was far. The sound faded after a while. I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, it felt weak and gray. I got up and checked outside. The ground was soft from rain earlier in the week. Near the back of the cabin, I saw marks in the dirt. Long, uneven lines, like something heavy had been dragged there. They led toward the trees and disappeared. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of them. My first thought was that someone had left trash or wood and moved it. But there was nothing around that explained the marks. I considered leaving that morning. I even put my bag by the door. But pride and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself the marks could be from a fallen branch or an animal carcass. I stayed. The second day felt worse. The air was thick and still. No wind. The woods were too quiet. I walked the area around the cabin, trying to get familiar with it. That was when I found the trail behind the trees. It wasn't on the map. It was narrow and uneven, like it had been walked on many times but never cared for. It led away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. I didn't follow it far. Something about it felt wrong, like it was meant to be hidden. That afternoon, I noticed the cabin door didn't sit right in the frame anymore. It still locked, but I had to pull it harder to close it fully. I checked the hinges again. One of the screws was loose. I tightened it with a small tool from my bag, but the feeling didn't leave. I started noticing scratches near the lock. Thin lines in the wood, not deep but new. That night, I didn't turn off the porch light. I sat on the couch with my jacket on, my phone charged and next to me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful steps on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Whoever it was didn't rush. They moved like they had all the time in the world. I stayed frozen, my body locked in place. The steps stopped near the door. I could hear breathing, faint but steady. The handle moved slightly. Not enough to open the door, just enough to test it. Then it stopped. Minutes passed. My muscles burned from staying still. Finally, the steps moved away. I waited until morning without sleeping. When daylight came, I packed everything. I didn't care about looking calm or organized. I just wanted to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My car tires were slashed. Not all of them, just 2 clean cuts. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Panic washed over me, sharp and hot. I thought about the trail again. I thought about the dragging marks. I thought about how someone had been close enough to touch my door in the night. I went back inside and locked it, even though it felt pointless. I checked for a phone signal. It was weak, but there was enough to send a message and make a call. I contacted emergency services and gave them the location, explaining everything as clearly as I could. I waited for hours. Every sound made me jump. I kept the curtains closed and stayed away from the windows. At some point, I heard movement outside again. Not on the porch this time, but around the cabin, slow and circling. I could see shadows pass under the door when they moved in front of the light. I held a heavy object in my hands, knowing it wouldn't help much, but needing something to grip. Eventually, I heard different sounds. An engine. Tires on dirt. The movement outside stopped. After a while, I heard voices in the distance, but they stayed outside and I didn't respond. When the knock finally came, it was firm and official, followed by the sound of someone trying the door with purpose, not secrecy. I opened it. The police searched the area. They followed the hidden trail and found a makeshift camp not far from the cabin. Old food wrappers, tools, a sleeping bag that smelled of sweat and dirt. Someone had been living there, watching the cabin, waiting for people like me. They told me similar reports had come in from nearby cabins, but not enough to shut the rentals down yet. They took me away from that place. My car was towed. I gave my statement, my hands shaking the whole time. Later, I learned they arrested a man a few days after my report. He had been staying in the woods for months, breaking into empty cabins, sometimes damaging cars to keep people trapped. He had a history of doing this in other areas. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't need to. The marks in the dirt, the footsteps, the breathing outside my door were enough to stay with me. Even now, when I think about quiet places, I remember how silence can hide things. I remember how close danger can get without making a sound. I went looking for peace, but I learned something else instead. I learned that being alone doesn't always mean being by yourself, and sometimes leaving is the only reason you survive. I rented the cabin because I wanted quiet, not because I wanted to be brave. I had just ended a long stretch of work that left my head loud even when the room was silent. The listing showed a small wooden cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by trees with no neighbors close enough to see. It promised no cell service, no traffic, and no people. That sounded perfect at the time. The drive there took longer than expected. The road slowly turned from clean pavement into cracked asphalt, then gravel, then something that barely looked like a road at all. Trees leaned inward the farther I went, branches brushing the sides of my car. The sky was already dull and gray even though it was early afternoon. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked older than the pictures. The wood was darker, soaked by years of rain. The porch sagged slightly in the middle. Leaves were piled in the corners like they had not been touched in a long time. I unlocked the door with the key from the lockbox and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like dust and cold wood. The place was small. One main room with a table, a couch, and a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to a bathroom and one bedroom. Everything looked clean enough, just worn. Scratches on the floor, dents in the walls, old marks that told quiet stories without words. I dropped my bag on the couch and stood there for a moment, listening. The cabin made soft noises as the wind moved around it. Nothing felt wrong yet. Just empty. I spent the first hour unpacking and wiping down surfaces. I opened windows to let fresh air in, though it barely helped. The woods outside were thick. Tall trees packed close together, blocking most of the light. The silence was heavy, broken only by the wind and distant birds. It felt like the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. By the time evening came, the sky had darkened fast. I made a simple meal and ate alone at the small table. I noticed how loud every movement sounded. The scrape of the chair, the tap of the fork, the soft hum of the old fridge. After eating, I washed the dishes and stood at the sink longer than needed, staring out the small window above it. All I could see were trees and shadows. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. Near the edge of the tree line, something looked disturbed. A patch of ground where leaves were pushed aside, not by wind but by repeated steps. A faint path leading deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably deer or hikers from long ago. The listing said the area was remote but not untouched. Still, the path seemed too narrow for animals and too deliberate to be random. As it got darker, I closed the windows and locked the door. The cabin had only one main door and a back door near the bedroom. I checked both locks twice. Then I pulled the curtains shut. Without outside light, the cabin felt even smaller. I turned on every lamp, filling the space with a weak yellow glow. I tried to read, but my focus kept slipping. The quiet started to feel different. Not peaceful anymore. Just empty, like something was missing. I could hear my own breathing clearly. I kept feeling like I needed to look up, like something was waiting just outside my view. I blamed it on being alone in a new place. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. The bedroom was colder than the rest of the cabin. I crawled under the blankets fully dressed, leaving the bedside lamp on. The walls felt thin. Every sound from outside felt closer, sharper. Branches scraped against the roof. Something small ran across the porch. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. So sleep came slow. I woke up suddenly sometime later. The room was silent in a way that felt wrong. Not even the wind. I lay still listening. Then I heard it. A soft, steady sound. Not loud. Just enough to notice. Footsteps on gravel. They were slow. Careful. Moving around the cabin. My body went stiff. I held my breath without thinking. The steps stopped near the front of the cabin. Then nothing. I waited, counting seconds in my head. My heart felt too loud. I thought about reaching for my phone, then remembered there was no signal. I thought about the car outside, about the long drive back through the woods. After what felt like a long time, the footsteps moved again. This time toward the side of the cabin. Toward the bedroom wall. The sound stopped again, closer than before. I stared at the wall, at the faint shadow cast by the lamp. I expected to see something appear there, some movement. Nothing happened. Eventually, the sound faded away. I stayed awake until morning, eyes burning, muscles tight. When light finally filtered through the curtains, I got out of bed slowly. I felt drained, like I had not rested at all. Outside, the ground around the cabin told a story I did not want to read. Fresh footprints in the gravel. Human footprints. They circled the cabin. Near the bedroom window, the leaves were crushed down as if someone had stood there for a while. I checked the locks again. Nothing was broken. Nothing missing. I packed my bag with shaking hands. I told myself I would leave, but another part of me hesitated. The car was fine. The road was empty. Daylight made everything look less threatening. I convinced myself it could have been a lost hiker, someone curious. I told myself I was overreacting. I stayed. The day dragged on. The woods felt different now. Too quiet. No birds. No wind. I kept noticing small things that felt off. A window I did not remember opening. A chair slightly out of place. I tried to explain it all away. Stress. Lack of sleep. My mind playing tricks on me. As evening came again, dread settled in my stomach. I locked the doors early and blocked them with furniture, even though it felt pointless. Kept the lights on. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, listening. Night fell heavier than before. The footsteps returned. This time they were closer. Louder. They moved from the front door to the windows, slow and patient. I could hear breathing now. Not mine. Low and controlled. Whoever it was knew I was there. I stayed frozen, afraid that any sound would give me away. The steps stopped at the back door. I heard the handle move slightly. Not forced. Just tested. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Then the sound of something dragging along the wall. Fingernails or a tool. I pressed my hands over my mouth to stop myself from making noise. My whole body shook. Then came the worst part. A soft knock. Not aggressive. Not rushed. just enough to say someone was there and waiting. I did not move. I did not react. I stayed still until my muscles screamed. Eventually the sounds faded again. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall. When light finally came, I did not hesitate. I grabbed my bag, unlocked the door, and ran to the car. The drive back felt endless. I did not stop until I reached a town with people, noise, and bright lights. Later I contacted the owner and reported everything. They responded days later with a short message saying the cabin had been removed from listings. No explanation. No apology. Weeks after, I looked it up out of curiosity. I found an old local article buried online. It mentioned the woods near that area. Multiple reports over the years of someone living off-grid, watching cabins, breaking in when people were gone, sometimes while they were still inside. Never caught. Always disappearing back into the trees. I understood then why the path behind the cabin looked worn. Why the footsteps were careful. Why the knocking was calm. That cabin was never empty. It was being used long before I arrived. I still wake up at night sometimes listening for footsteps. Even in my apartment, surrounded by people, I keep the lights on. Because I learned something in those woods. Silence does not mean safety. And isolation does not mean you are alone. I remember the first time I stayed at that cabin, the kind of place that promises quiet, solitude, and an escape from everything familiar. It was tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick pine trees that blocked most of the sunlight. I had been driving for hours on narrow, twisting roads, the kind that always seem longer than they look on a map. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the treetops, and the whole forest seemed to shift into a darker shade of green, almost black. The cabin itself was small, made of dark, weathered logs, with a tin roof that looked older than anything I had ever seen. I parked my car on the uneven dirt path, listening to it crunch under the tires, and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. It was a mix of damp wood, must, and something faintly like rusted metal. The cabin was empty, or at least it felt empty. Dust lay thick on the corners of the furniture, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating in a way I hadn't expected. I set my bag down and ran my fingers over the table. It felt sticky, like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself that I had chosen this place to be alone, that the silence was part of its charm. I explored the small cabin slowly. There was a tiny kitchen with a rusted stove and a sink that hadn't seen running water in ages. The bedroom was no bigger than a closet, with a single bed and a threadbare blanket. Outside, a small porch overlooked a clearing, the ground uneven and overgrown with wild grass. I noticed the trees pressed close to the edge of the clearing, almost forming a wall around the cabin. The shadows among the trees seemed thicker than they should have been, darker, moving slightly in ways that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. I unpacked my things and decided to start a fire. The cabin had a fireplace, and I had brought kindling and a small axe just in case. As I chopped the wood, the sound echoed unnaturally through the cabin, making me feel exposed, like every creak and snap was amplified in the walls. When the fire finally caught, I sat on the floor, letting the warmth spread slowly. Outside, the wind rustled the treetops, a constant whispering that seemed almost alive. I told myself it was just the wind, but I could feel the hair on my arms standing up. Hours passed and the forest grew darker. I hadn't seen another person since the drive up, and the isolation started to press against me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The wind changed direction suddenly, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the cabin. I tried to distract myself by unpacking more things, writing in my notebook, but every little noise, the creak of the floor, the soft thump outside, made me freeze. I realized that I had no way to call anyone. My phone had barely a signal when I drove up, and now it was dead, the battery giving its final warning before the screen went black. Later I went outside to look around the clearing. The moon had risen, casting a silver light over the uneven ground. Shadows stretched and twisted in strange ways, and the trees looked taller, darker, like they were watching me. I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a faint trail, almost like a path, leading from the edge of the clearing into the forest. My stomach sank. It didn't look like it had been made by animals. I felt a sudden urge to go back inside, but curiosity pressed me forward. I stepped carefully along the trail, listening. The forest was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I couldn't see far. The trees pressed close together, and the darkness swallowed everything beyond a few feet. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my chest tighten. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. Footsteps coming closer, crunching over dead leaves. My mind raced. I could see the outline of a tree and pressed myself against it, heart pounding, breath shallow. The sound stopped for a moment and I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Then it started again, faint at first but getting louder. I could hear the rhythm, steady and certain, moving toward me. Panic set in. I turned and ran blindly through the trees, branches slapping my face and arms. The trail I had been following disappeared under the darkness, replaced by the endless maze of the forest. I didn't stop until I felt the uneven ground of the clearing under my feet again, the cabin just ahead. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, breathing hard, sweat running down my back. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had heard. Had I imagined it? The footsteps? The pressure of being watched? I couldn't tell, but the fear in my chest was real. I spent the rest of the night on the floor by the fire, clutching the axe I had brought. Every little noise made me jump. The wind howled around the cabin, and at one point I thought I saw a shadow move across the window. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself that I had survived this far, that whatever it was, it couldn't get in without making a noise. I watched the fire until it burned low and the first hint of dawn touched the sky. When the morning finally came, the world outside looked almost normal. The sun glinted through the trees, and the forest seemed peaceful again. I cautiously stepped outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place except for the faint trail leading into the woods. I took a deep breath, telling myself I had to leave, that I had stayed long enough. The drive back was tense but quiet. Every shadow along the road made me flinch, every rustle in the trees had me checking the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, the first real signs of civilization, paved roads, mailboxes, houses, felt almost surreal. I pulled over at a small cafe, hands shaking, and ordered coffee just to feel steady again. I sat by the window looking back toward the road that led into the trees. The memory of that night pressed against me, heavy and real, but I felt a sense of relief knowing I had made it out. In the end, the experience stayed with me, not like a nightmare but like a warning. The forest and that cabin were nothing supernatural, nothing magical, but the isolation and the unknown had a way of twisting reality into something far more frightening than any story. I learned to respect the quiet, to respect the shadows, and above all, to trust my instincts. Being alone in a place where no one can hear you changes the way you see the world, sharpens every sense, and leaves a mark you don't forget. I never went back and I never will, but I keep the memory close, not as a tale of horror, but as a lesson in the power of solitude, and the danger of underestimating the natural world when it is truly, utterly alone. Even now, when I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I remember that cabin. I remember the way the forest seemed to watch me, the way every sound became a warning, and I feel a deep, quiet understanding of the wilderness. It's not about ghosts or monsters, it's about respect, preparation, and knowing your limits. That cabin taught me all of that, and it taught me something else. Fear isn't always about what's out there. Sometimes it's about what's inside you, and learning to face it is the only way to come out whole. I drove up the mountain road later than I planned, the sky already dull and heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything feel flatter and colder. The cabin belonged to a friend who barely used it anymore. It sat alone in a stretch of forest that didn't have phone signal, which I knew before I went. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone for a few days and clear my head. The road narrowed into dirt, then into something that barely felt like a road at all. Pine needles scraped the underside of my car and branches brushed against the doors. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than the pictures. It leaned slightly to one side, like it had settled wrong years ago and never fixed itself. The place smelled old the moment I opened the door. Not rotten, just stale, like wood that had been closed up for too long. Dust floated in the air when I stepped inside. The floor creaked under my boots in a way that felt too loud in the silence. There was one main room, a tiny kitchen corner, a bathroom, and a narrow bedroom in the back. No electricity except a small solar panel that powered a single light and a radio. The windows were narrow and placed high, which made the inside darker even during the day. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked through the cabin slowly, checking each corner. Everything was basic and worn. Scratches on the table, old water stains on the ceiling, a couch with fabric rubbed thin in the middle. The door had 3 locks, which I noticed right away. That made me pause longer than I expected. I locked them all anyway, telling myself it was normal for a place this remote. By the time I finished unpacking, the light outside had started to fade. The forest changed with it. During the day, the trees felt calm, almost soft. At night, they became heavy shapes pressing in on the cabin. The wind picked up, pushing branches against the walls. The sound was uneven, sometimes slow, sometimes sharp, and it made it hard to relax. I cooked something simple and ate standing up, not really hungry. I kept glancing at the windows even though I couldn't see much beyond my own reflection. I tried to sleep early, but the bed felt wrong. Every small noise pulled my attention. The cabin popped as it cooled, wood shifting in the dark. Something scratched lightly along the side of the building. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing past. So my body stayed tense. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths until I finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight cutting through the dust in the air. For a few seconds, everything felt normal again. I made coffee and sat on the small porch, listening to the forest wake up. Birds moved between the trees. The fear from the night before felt embarrassing in daylight. I spent the morning walking around the area, staying close to the cabin. There was no real path, just patches of ground that looked slightly more worn than the rest. I noticed old footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin. They didn't look fresh, but they also didn't look very old. I told myself they could have been from the owner or someone checking on the place months ago. By afternoon, clouds rolled in again. The light dimmed fast. I went back inside and tried to read, but I kept losing my place. The quiet felt thicker than before. Around dusk, I heard something heavy moving outside. Not fast, not light. It sounded like slow steps on dry ground, circling the cabin. I froze, listening. The steps stopped near one of the windows. I waited for something else to happen, but nothing did. After a while, the sound moved away. I didn't open the door. I didn't look outside. I sat on the couch until my muscles ached from staying still. When night came, it came hard. The forest went silent in a way that didn't feel natural. No insects, no wind. Just nothing. That scared me more than noise ever could. Later that night, the scratching came back. This time it wasn't random. It was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something along the wood. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other. My chest felt tight, my heart beating so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. I stayed on the bed, holding my breath, listening. The scratching stopped near the door. After a long pause, there was pressure against it, not enough to open it, just enough to test it. The locks held. I don't know how long I stayed awake like that. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. In the morning, I found marks on the door. Long, shallow lines carved into the wood near the handle. They were too even to be from an animal. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach sinking. I checked the windows next. One of them had a smear across the glass, like a hand had pressed against it and slid down. The print was faint but wide, wider than mine. I packed my bag immediately. I didn't care about staying anymore. I just wanted to leave. When I went to my car, my chest dropped. One of the tires was flat, sliced clean along the side. Not punctured, sliced. I stood there shaking, the quiet around me suddenly feeling like it was watching. I went back inside and locked the door again. I tried the radio, hoping for any signal. It crackled but gave nothing useful. I spent the day pacing, checking the windows, counting the hours. I found more footprints in the dirt, fresher this time, closer to the cabin. They circled it like before. As night fell again, I pushed furniture against the door. My hands hurt from gripping things too tightly. The forest grew loud with wind this time, branches slamming against the walls. Then the steps returned. Slower than before. Heavier. They stopped right outside the door. The handle moved slightly, just enough to rattle. Whoever was outside didn't rush. They waited. The pressure against the door grew. Not enough to break it, just enough to remind me how thin it was. I stayed silent, my body curled in on itself. Time stretched. Eventually the pressure eased. The steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I heard an engine in the distance. It was faint but real. I ran outside without thinking, waving my arms, my throat raw even though I made no sound. A truck came into view, slow and careful on the road. The driver stopped when he saw me. I pointed at my car at the tire at the cabin. He didn't ask questions. He helped me load my bag and drove me down the mountain. Before we left, I looked back at the cabin. In the dirt near the door, the footprints were clear now. Human. Barefoot. Leading away into the trees. I never went back. Later, I learned the cabin had been broken into before more than once. People passing through the area, living off the land, watching places like that, waiting for someone alone. Knowing that made everything clearer and worse at the same time. What scared me most wasn't the marks on the door or the footsteps in the dark. It was how patient it all felt. How close I came to being trapped without ever seeing a face. That cabin still sits up there, quiet and empty, and I know now that isolation doesn't mean safety. Sometimes it just means there's no one around to hear you if something goes wrong. I had always loved being alone in the woods, even if only for a weekend. The smell of pine, the quiet rustle of leaves, and the soft, uneven crunch of my boots on the dirt trail always made me feel alive in a way nothing else could. This time, I had rented a small cabin miles away from the nearest town, deep in a dense forest I had never visited before. I packed my bag with the essentials: canned food, water, a first aid kit, my sleeping bag, and a flashlight. I had no cell service, and I liked it that way. I thought I wanted to test myself to see if I could survive for a few days alone, disconnected from everything else. I had no idea what was waiting for me. The cabin was a little older than I expected, built from rough, dark wood that had faded and weathered over time. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and I noticed a few shingles had come loose. There was a small porch with a broken chair that creaked when I sat down, and a single narrow window that overlooked the forest. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside, a mix of dust, damp wood, and the faintly sour smell of mold. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just an old building. I set my bag down, unpacked my supplies, and started a small fire in the rusty fireplace. The cabin's stove and fridge were barely functional, but I didn't mind. I was here to escape, not to live in luxury. The first night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I lay in the small bed, listening to the wind whip through the trees, hearing branches scrape against the roof. It was comforting at first, the sound so familiar from my childhood hikes. But as the hours passed, the quiet became oppressive. Every sound seemed louder, sharper. My mind started picking out shapes in the darkness, shadows and corners that weren't really there. I kept telling myself I was fine, that it was just my imagination, but sleep was elusive. I woke up several times, each time thinking I had heard someone walking outside. Each time I checked the window, there was nothing, only the dark, endless forest. On the second day, I decided to explore the woods a little. I stayed on a narrow trail I thought might lead to a stream I had seen on the map. The trail was overgrown, and the underbrush scratched my legs and arms as I pushed through. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches thicker, blotting out the sunlight. I kept seeing broken twigs and flattened grass, as if someone or something had passed that way recently. My heart would skip a beat every time I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. Just the wind, rustling leaves. I told myself over and over that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the third day, the isolation was starting to get to me. I tried to keep busy, chopping firewood, cleaning the cabin, and reading a book I had brought. But the forest outside seemed to close in, pressing against the walls of the cabin. At night, I kept hearing noises I couldn't explain. The sharp crack of a branch breaking, the thump of something heavy moving in the underbrush, even low, guttural sounds that didn't seem animal. I stayed up for hours, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark around the cabin. I kept convincing myself that it was a bear or a deer or maybe just the wind, but the unease wouldn't leave me. I started locking the door every night and barring the windows with whatever I could find. The isolation was turning into paranoia, and I hated that about myself. It was on the fourth night that things got worse. I was lying in bed trying to sleep, when I heard it again, a low, deliberate thud outside the cabin. My heart jumped and I froze, listening. Hud, hud, hud. Slow, heavy and rhythmic. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving near the cabin. I didn't know whether to stay in bed or investigate. I felt trapped, every instinct screaming at me to hide, but curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, peering out. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the thick forest. And yet, the sounds continued, moving closer, circling the cabin just beyond the reach of my light. I realized then that I wasn't alone. Something was definitely out there. My mind raced through possibilities. A wild animal, a hiker who had lost their way, maybe even someone with ill intentions. I tried calling my friends, but there was no signal. The battery on my phone was low. Panic began to creep in. I remembered the small axe I had packed for firewood, probably useless against someone determined, but it was all I had. I sat in the corner of the room, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other, listening. Every thump and scrape outside made my pulse hammer in my ears. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. At some point the noises stopped. Silence fell so suddenly that it was almost worse than the noise. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting, listening for any sound. By morning I felt exhausted, shaking and tense. I needed to leave. Staying another night was unthinkable. I packed my things as quickly as I could, leaving food and supplies behind. As I stepped outside, the forest looked different in daylight. Shadows that had seemed menacing at night were now harmless. Broken branches and tracks in the dirt made it clear that someone had been near the cabin, probably the night before. I didn't see anyone around, but it didn't matter. I started walking back to the main trail, keeping my eyes on the trees and listening for the slightest sound. My legs were sore, my arms scratched, but I didn't stop. Every step took me closer to civilization, to safety. After hours of walking, I finally reached the main road. A small car passed by and I flagged it down, explaining my situation. The driver looked concerned and offered to give me a ride to the nearest town. Sitting in that car, moving away from the forest, I felt my tension ease for the first time in days. I knew I had been lucky. Whatever had been circling the cabin that night hadn't approached me directly, and I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, or even an animal. I didn't know, and I didn't want to. When I finally got back to my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted but relieved. I unpacked my things, leaving the memory of the cabin behind. I didn't go back, and I didn't try to contact anyone about what had happened. The experience stayed with me, though, lingering in my mind every time I thought about being alone in the woods. It taught me something I hadn't realized before. Solitude is beautiful, but isolation can be dangerous. Being aware of your surroundings, being prepared, and respecting the unpredictability of nature are essential. In the weeks after the trip, I couldn't stop thinking about that fourth night. Every shadow in my apartment seemed sharper, every noise in the street louder. But slowly the panic faded, replaced by a cautious respect for the wilderness. I started hiking again, but only in places where there were trails and other people. I still love the woods, the way the sunlight filters through the trees, the smell of pine after rain. But now I carry a flashlight, a whistle, and a fully charged phone. I never take my safety for granted again. Looking back, I realized that the cabin wasn't scary because of anything supernatural. It was scary because of how alone I was, how vulnerable I felt, and how quickly the human mind can turn even harmless sounds into threats when left in isolation. The forest hadn't changed, but I had. I had learned fear, caution, and resilience all in one terrifying weekend. And even though it was terrifying, I'm grateful for the lesson. I'm stronger now, more aware, and a little wiser. That cabin in the woods, dark and weathered, will always be a part of me, not as a place of ghosts or fairy tales, but as a place where I faced fear alone and came out alive. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. My plan was simple: escape the city, leave my phone off, and spend 2 days alone at the cabin I had rented deep in the woods. It was supposed to be peaceful, an opportunity to read, hike, and just breathe. The drive there had been long, winding through narrow, twisting roads flanked by thick trees. I watched the sunlight slanting through the branches, flickering across the asphalt like golden shards, and I felt the first rush of freedom. The cabin was small but solid. It smelled of pine and old wood. The furniture was rustic, everything made of dark, polished timber. A cast iron stove sat in the corner. The fireplace in the living room was empty but clean. Outside, a narrow trail led into the dense forest, and beyond that, a small creek wound lazily through the trees. I unpacked slowly, placing my bag on the bed, a few groceries on the counter, and my jacket on a hook by the door. The sun was still high, so I decided to explore the surrounding area. The trail was overgrown in parts, but manageable. I walked barefoot along the creek, feeling the cool water over my toes, listening to the birds and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Everything seemed perfect. As the light began to fade, I returned to the cabin and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth made the cabin feel cozy, and the crackling sound was comforting. I made a simple dinner, then settled on the sofa with a blanket and a book. That was when I noticed it. A subtle creaking sound from the floor above. I froze. The cabin had a loft where I assumed the owners sometimes slept. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. Old cabins do that, right? I went back to reading, but the creaking continued, sporadically, almost like soft footsteps. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But after a while, I realized it wasn't just a settling noise. It was deliberate, slow, careful. I stopped breathing, straining my ears. Each step sounded heavier than the last, then lighter, than nothing at all. I held my breath, telling myself it was the wind, maybe a branch scraping the roof. But something in me refused to relax. I got up and checked the windows. All of them were locked. The front door too. I even checked the back. No signs of anyone around. I went upstairs slowly, my bare feet silent on the old wooden stairs. The loft was empty. No sign anyone had been there since the last cleaning. My heart raced. I returned to the living room, trying to calm myself, but then I noticed another sound, a faint tapping from the wall near the fireplace. The tapping became a rhythm, slow at first, then faster. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, a branch hitting the cabin, a bird trapped somewhere. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and shined it along the walls. Nothing. Just shadows that danced with the firelight. My stomach twisted with unease, but I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I was alone and there was no one else here. I decided to sleep early, hoping that morning would bring relief. I dragged a blanket and pillow into the loft, lying down as the fire died in the fireplace. The shadows stretched across the cabin walls like long fingers. That's when I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. My pulse jumped. They stopped at the top of the stairs. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them, feel their weight. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I froze, listening. The footsteps moved down the stairs slowly, closer to me. I grabbed a heavy metal lamp from the table beside me. The sound paused. Then nothing. I waited for what felt like an hour, my body rigid. When I finally dared to look, the stairs were empty. I checked the loft door. Locked. Every window. Locked. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I was paralyzed by fear. Hours passed like that. Every little creak, every shadow, every tap sent me into panic. Sleep was impossible. I felt trapped, claustrophobic, as if the cabin itself had turned against me. At some point, I realized the fire had died completely, leaving the room in near darkness. I huddled under the blanket, listening. That's when I noticed something else. A smell, faint but distinct. It was the smell of smoke, but not from the fireplace. It was acrid, metallic, like something had burned outside recently. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal to call for help, but there was none. Not even a single bar. My heart pounded as I considered leaving, but outside, the forest was impenetrable at night, and I had no idea which way led back to the road. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, too terrified to move. Around 3 in the morning, the cabin settled. The footsteps stopped. The tapping disappeared. The smell faded. I sat in the darkness, shaking, telling myself I had imagined it. Maybe the cabin's old pipes, maybe the wind. But my gut told me something had been there. Something human. I waited until dawn, every noise magnified, every shadow suspicious. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, smelling of pine and wet earth. I noticed footprints in the mud leading around the cabin, circling it. Small but definitely human. My blood ran cold. Whoever had been there hadn't left through the main trail. I could see where the grass was disturbed, leading into the thicker woods. I packed my things quickly, leaving food and books behind. Every snapping twig made me jump, and I kept checking behind me as I ran toward the road. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, screaming. The driver stopped, and I explained breathlessly that someone had been in the cabin. They didn't question me, they just drove me back to town. I called the local authorities, and a team went to inspect the cabin. They found footprints inside and outside, but no one had been living there. Nothing was stolen. It was as if someone had been watching me, waiting, then left once they knew I had noticed. I never stayed there again. It took me weeks to sleep normally after that weekend. I kept thinking about the footprints, the steps, the tapping. But I also learned something important. Even in places that seem safe, there's a very real vulnerability when you're alone. Nature is beautiful, but isolation can make ordinary events terrifying. I realized I was stronger than I thought, that I could survive fear and make it out alive, but I also understood that caution, awareness, and respect for my own limits were essential. Now, whenever I see a cabin advertisement or a remote forest, I remember that weekend. The memory doesn't haunt me in a supernatural way, it's a lesson in realism. People can be unpredictable. Woods can be beautiful but dangerous. And sometimes, the scariest stories are the ones that could actually happen, not the ones that only exist in fairy tales.